You're listening to School Counseling Simplified, a podcast with easy-to-implement strategies for busy school counselors. Here's your host, Rachel Davis from Bright Futures Counseling.
I'm so excited to announce that it's time for our second annual Summer Summit. So what is the Summer Summit? This is my virtual conference for school counselors, and we have 15 amazing specialists, and they're going to cover a variety of topics. Guys, you're going to love this. We have everyone from behavior specialists and therapists to trauma and inclusion experts. And of course, you'll be hearing from your fellow school counselors. Some of the topics cover leading courageous conversations through restorative forums, from burnout to balance, how to use summer break to strategize your burnout prevention and recovery, 3 joyful ways to center equity in your counseling practice, and tackling undesirable behaviors, helping teachers make classrooms thrive. You don't want to miss this. This is the perfect thing to do over your summer break to get you excited and ready for an awesome school year. So you may be thinking, yes, this sounds amazing. How do I sign up? Well, this conference is exclusive for Impact members, but no worries, you can totally join us. For $29, you can get your Summer Summit conference ticket plus your first month of Impact. Go to stressfreeschoolcounseling.com/summit to check out the awesome lineup and all the details. The Summer Summit starts on June 20th, so hurry and check it out. Believe me, you don't want to miss this. Thanks for listening to another episode of School Counseling Simplified. You guys are going to love today's guest. Today, I interview Joyce from Trauma Informed SEL, and we talk all about the trauma response in children, how it affects their education, how counselors can help and be more trauma informed, how we can help our teachers and schools in general be more trauma informed. I learned so much. To prepare for my podcast interviews, I always have some questions. I send them to the guest ahead of time so they can feel prepared. And then we pretty much stick to the script more or less. But this time, I just picked her brain about everything. Went completely off script. I am so passionate about this topic. I want to learn more. I want you guys to learn more. I'm so pumped on it. I think you're going to love this episode. And she is one of our presenters at Summer Summit. So if you like this episode with Joyce, if you're like, oh my gosh, yes, tell me more, then you are going to absolutely love her presentation at Summer Summit, where she'll be talking to us all about trauma-informed solutions to challenging behaviors. So I know many of you have students who exhibit these challenging behaviors, and you and the teachers are honestly at a loss on what to do, which is why I think her session is going to be so powerful. She's also going to be there for part of our live Q&A. So during Summer Summit, we're going to have live Q&A with the presenters where you can ask them questions about their presentations, and we're going to have a lot of giveaways. So I'm pumped. Summer Summit's going to be awesome. I cannot wait. So let's dive into this episode with Joyce. Hi, Joyce. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I am so excited to interview you because we are gearing up for our Summer Summit, and you are one of our presenters. You are the trauma expert. And
I am.
Yes, I cannot wait to pick your brain in today's episode, and also to hear from you at the Summer Summit, because I just know this is an area that unfortunately so many of our students are experiencing, and so many of our counselors feel ill-equipped on how to handle. So, yes. But they want to help. So let's help them help the kiddos. So start with telling us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Yes. So my name is Joyce Harduvel. I have been in school social work for 7 years now. I got into it sort of by accident. I went to grad school at a program that offered a wide variety of programs. And so the original plan was I wanted to be helping to write policy for like around education and things like that. And then I got an internship in a school, and I was like, wow, this is so fun. And also I have to say, I came in with the bias that I felt like school social workers, school counselors, like couldn't really make a difference. I was like, it's too small, working with individual kids. And I was very much proved wrong during my internship. And so that's what made me totally switch and end up doing school social work now for 7 years. And it's been great. I work for Chicago Public Schools, and I've worked in schools all across Chicago's South Side for all my Chicago friends, primarily in the Englewood neighborhood. And so it's a great community, really, really supportive. I love that we have lots of intergenerational family support. And we also have a lot of community violence and a lot of trauma showing up for our students. And so that was something that I was sort of passionate about learning how to address during my program. But also the more I did my work, the more I was like, wow, this is really, really important to know, because it's students who've experienced trauma, their reactions to things can be very different from what we might predict. And it can be really, really challenging because unfortunately we can't like discipline the trauma response out of someone. And I think we need more resources to help. I would say counselors and social workers too, but also especially teachers. They're the ones with our students all day long. And they're also, unlike us, like they didn't get quite as much training on these types of topics. And so this is a place where I feel like we as school-based clinicians can really, really leverage our training and skills to support the people that are with our kids all day long.
Yes, absolutely. Can you, and I have so many questions for you, but can you just give us an example of a way that a child with trauma may respond to something that's like atypical from what we would expect?
Yeah. I had one very recently where the kid had experienced very significant trauma pretty recently, a young kid in kindergarten. And, the brain works in crazy ways. Every single day around the time of day that trauma had occurred, he would just start ripping the room apart, hitting people. And this was not his normal personality at all, but it was just this visceral response to this very recent trauma. And there's no amount of, letting him know you're safe, you're not, that person isn't in your life anymore. Of course, we still say all those things, but like that's not going to solve the problem. And so it became a task of figuring out how do we keep this child and his classmates safe, while also honoring, like, we don't want to grab and just hold, restrain him every single day at this time, especially knowing what he's gone through. Like that's not going to be helpful. And so how do we sort of two-pronged, one, help him repair and learn emotion regulation skills and just sort of work through this really challenging thing he experienced. And then also on the other hand, like, how do we make sure that he's safe, that the classroom is safe, that learning is continuing, all this other kind of stuff. And I don't think that's something that they tell teachers that they're getting themselves in for when they sign up to be a teacher.
Sure. Right. And just from an outside perspective, if you just see, I'm just thinking this is not traumatic, but just a way, how background of behavior matters. Like I'm just thinking of my own son, like having a meltdown the other day. And it's because I knew that he had like skipped a nap. And so I was like, okay, this makes sense that he's responding this way because he skipped his nap. But like an outsider's like, that lady needs to discipline her child. You know what I mean? So right. For a teacher who, a new teacher maybe who doesn't know or have this background, or anyone really who sees this behavior, like, oh my gosh, we can't let this child destroy the classroom. Like they need to be punished. But when in fact, that's definitely not the solution. And I love what you said about the restraining, because I was taught that. I even went to a workshop as a counselor on like those, how to do the safe restraints and stuff. Thankfully, I didn't have to use it, but I don't even know it. That's probably not even best practice anymore. I mean, especially if it was a physical abuse thing, right?
Exactly. And so here's the thing. I will also fully admit, I was a restrainer. I was trained in restraints. Mm-hmm. And so when I first started, that's what I would do because that's what I had in my toolbox. And now I look back kind of horrified and again, like I did things the way I was told to, like they were safe and things like that. But I'm like, thinking of, it was really just one, or I guess two kids I've had to restrain. One was like several times. And when I think about his background, I'm like, luckily, we have a positive relationship, things like that. I don't think that I like ruined his life by restraining him, but now I know better. And now I know that I have other tools that I think I could have used. I think that we get really freaked out about these big behaviors and we ourselves go into that like fight or flight response. And so we don't know what to do. And so, I used what I knew, which was like, here's how I can restrain this kid. And I think now what I've learned instead is like, sometimes you got to let go. Like, I'm sorry, I have worked so hard to make my room a beautiful space, but sometimes it gets messed up. Like sometimes kids will rip stuff off the walls and I don't like it. And I certainly tell them in the aftermath, like, hey, that really hurt my feelings because I worked really hard to make this a pretty space. And so when you ripped all my stuff off the wall, it made me feel sad. However, it's just stuff. It's okay. I will survive. And so probably better not to add to, because, there are also like tons of stories now of adults coming out talking about treatment that they had in schools and how it further traumatized them. And I certainly would never want to add to that.
Right. Right. Oh, I love that example because I've been there before too, where my office is just getting torn apart and you're like, oh, I wanted to, like, it hurts you. You're like viscerally mad, offended, whatever. Yeah, we have our own emotions that we're bringing into it too, even if we have the training. So sorry, like I said, I have these pre-questions I sent you, but I just want to dive deeper into this example because it's fascinating. So the student that you were saying was having this like outburst at the same time every day. So what was the response? How, like, what do you recommend that we do if this is happening?
So we equipped the teacher with a little go bag because the best thing to do in that situation, because I mean, ideally, right, sometimes you can usher that child out of the classroom and into a safe space. In this particular case, and again, we know that when kids go into that fight or flight mode, they are not listening or thinking logically. And so giving them complex directions or things like that, it might not register with them in that moment. And so this was a kid for whom he was not going to follow that direction. And I am not going to drag a kid in the middle of like a trauma response episode out of the room. And teachers hate this. And I get it. I get that it's super disruptive and it sucks, but we train the teacher to take all the other kids. Like, hey, we know Tommy's having a hard time today. We're going to just send him some well wishes. In the meantime, we're just going to go. And they had like another classroom that they could go to. And then the teacher had a bag with just some little worksheets and just things like that they could work on. And then once the kid was de-escalated, then of course they would come back into the classroom. And so that was sort of step one, is coming up with an emergency response for when it was happening. And then also, like, as a social worker, similar to counselors, like making sure like, okay, what outside support is he getting? Like, because you're going to need some therapy beyond what a school-based clinician can provide to deal with all that stuff. So making sure that that's set up, and then also just like really taking a step back and building that sense of safety for the kid in the school. Not that the trauma happened in the school, but just making sure that they know when you're here, you are safe. We are not going to let anything happen to you, and building just a strong, trusting relationship with the kid. Which is honestly the opposite of what we sometimes go to. Like sometimes when our kids have these big behavioral responses, our instinct is to push them away and give them messages that they're like a bad kid or that they just need to get it together. And unfortunately, that makes them feel more disconnected, which makes them feel more unsafe, which makes the behaviors worse.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much. I love those like tactical strategies, because I'm sure some counselors were listening and they're like, oh my gosh, this happened to us recently, you know? So yes, that's so good. And then you had mentioned about teaching like some of those self-regulation skills. So are you then meeting with the students, or is the school counselor meeting with them as well, in addition to that outside support to work on this?
Yeah. So in Chicago public schools, I know it's different everywhere. The way we do it is that typically if a kid has more significant issues, it gets to be the point of like a 504 plan or an IEP. And then the social worker steps in and is providing those services. And it's typically the counselor that's doing more of our like classroom wide stuff, as well as more short-term, less disability related counseling and things like that. So in this case, it would be the social worker who's stepping in and creating a goal. So for this kid, the goal is just to be able to understand your emotions and start to recognize what are the signs in your body gonna let you know that you're about to lose control, and that it's been, you're having that trauma response. And here's the thing, even with a kindergartner, I think it's really possible to teach kids what's going on in their brain. And I think it's been so helpful for many kids when I'm like, you know why when you're fighting and your teacher is telling you stop, you're going to get in trouble, why you don't stop and listen and stop fighting? It's because your brain, like your prefrontal cortex, is not even in the picture in that moment. It is not engaged. And so it's not you being, you're not willfully trying to disobey in that moment. It's just that your thinking brain has left the chat, and, not saying that that's okay and that we're approving of fighting, of course, but like, that's why that happens. And so we need to learn how to stop before we get to that point. And kids, that's like an aha moment for kids, because they can really understand it and how they've experienced that. And then it helps them understand, like, okay, when I notice that, I'm going down to the lower centers of my brain, then here are the strategies that I've learned with my counselor or my social worker that I can use to make sure that I am safe and that I'm keeping everybody around me safe too. And I just think, in my experience, I was scared to teach that to little ones. I'm like, of course, the middle schoolers and high schoolers are going to be able to grasp it. Not worried about that, but I've been shocked. I use the conscious discipline, like red brain, blue brain, green brain. Like if you go on their website, they have a ton of resources about it. And the like kids would come up to me, little ones, and be like, I'm in my red brain right now. I need some help. And
yeah,
so
that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, just being self-aware. Yeah, the whole time you were talking about that, I was just nodding my head yes, because I find it so empowering when the students have like the language or just the understanding of, it's my brain. It's like biological. It's not me choosing to, be a bad kid or choosing to not follow directions or choosing to be disrespectful, whatever. So
Yep.
yes, I love this. I know my audience is definitely resonating too, but I'm curious, have you gotten any pushback from parents or teachers? Because I'm just thinking of you saying like the kids having to leave the room. I could just see some parents being like, what do you mean my child's learning was disrupted because some other kid was having a meltdown? I'm sure that comes up. Do you have any strategies for dealing with that pushback?
That's honestly the hardest part. So I think step one for me is making sure that I have positive relationships with teachers and as many families as I can, because once I get that buy-in and that they trust me and think I know what I'm doing, and then they're more likely to understand, okay, I don't know about this idea that you have, but I'm willing to give it a try. And then just really focusing on the commonalities, especially I think it's a harder conversation even with parents. I feel like with teachers, if I can at least get my principal on board, then they're like, well, this is what I have to do and I'll give it a try. They see that it works and it helps. But with parents, I try to really find the commonality, which is we both care very much about keeping children safe at school. So I do not want to disrupt your kids' learning. Not the best case scenario at all. But I also, my number one priority is that I don't want to send your kid home injured at the end of the day. And so this is, I know it sounds a little non-conventional, but this is actually the best way that I can keep your child safe while keeping all the other children in the classroom safe too. And we are also putting stuff in place so that learning is not disrupted, so that we are still, maybe just a couple seconds, but guess what? That would have happened inevitably. Like there are always behavioral incidents that take away a few seconds of learning. And so we just want to make that be like a very planned, intentional, get your kid from point A to point B and get them back to their learning. But that's honestly, I'm making it sound easier than it is. You'll still get people who don't love the idea. And, that's okay. It's still best practice and it's still the way that we're going to handle things. And that's when I hopefully like you can tap into an administrator who has your back or something like that, who can just sort of say like, no, this is just how we're going to handle this.
Right.
This
and having the go back. I mean, you have, like you said, systems in place. You're not just like everyone wait in the hallway until he's done his episode. Right. And then can you tell me, so you called it a traumatic response episode, or what did you refer? I like that so much better. Trauma response episode. I like that so much better than just saying like behavior or something like that. I think that's so important to call it what it is.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you for diving deep in that example. I was just really curious about that. But tell us, so how does trauma affect our students' ability to learn?
Yeah, in so many ways, because we all have all these like different neural connections in our brain, and the ones that get used more get really, really strong because our brain is looking for patterns all the time. Otherwise, I mean, there's just too much stimuli in the world for us to go around and not expect things to follow the pattern. Like if I am at a red light, my brain knows that at some point it's going to turn green because that's been my experience in the past. But unfortunately, sometimes our kids are strengthening these neural connections that are telling them like, if I get in trouble, that means I'm going to be hurt by an adult, or, whatever their different, if I go outside, someone might hurt me, or whatever their different past experiences have been. Unfortunately, sometimes those get strengthened in such a way that that's the pattern that they're looking for. And so those kids, especially kids who've either experienced complex trauma, so like especially when the trauma happens in the context of a relationship where that child was supposed to be taken care of by that person and they instead have been hurt by them, that's makes things a little bit more challenging. And then also, if they live in, for example, like a community with a lot of violence and they are continually experiencing these traumas, that's really tough too. And what happens is those children start to prioritize being vigilant over thinking long-term, planning, learning, things like that, because their brain is constantly scanning for a threat. And you get some really difficult changes in the brain, such as, for example, there's studies that show that kids who've experienced significant trauma will look at a neutral face and assume a negative emotion. So they'll look at a face that's just neutral and they'll see an angry face. So that's hard, right? Because we'll give an instruction in a neutral way as adults in school, and the kid thinks we are saying it in a malicious way or trying to attack them, when that's not the case at all. You see overreaction to things that they find threatening. The kids are jumpy. They have trouble seeing and remembering the positive things. They're really focused on the negative, and that really sticks in their brain. You also get your dissociators, who are in the classroom physically, but their brain is somewhere else. And, those are the kids who are sleeping or have their head down or just not really engaged. And then just, basically what's happening here is these kids have stress hormones that are constantly being released. And so that's exhausting to be on a swivel all the time. There's more chronic illness, difficulty with memory, difficulty paying attention, aggression, self-harm. You might see kids reenacting relationship dynamics that they've seen in their lives that are not healthy. Can be difficult for them to establish and maintain healthy relationships. They can be very irritable, get angry easily. With our bigger kids, we see like some really scary, risky behaviors or substance use, things like that. And then also lots of anxiety, depression, and just lack of self-worth is a hard one. And so is, you get the kids who they are so focused on the moment and keeping themselves safe in the moment that it's hard to connect with them in a school setting, because they're not thinking about college one day because they're so worried about, surviving the day. And so it can be hard to motivate them to succeed in a school environment, because their brains, and it's like not them. It's not a choice that they're making. It's like their brains are wired to be looking for the threat now, not to be thinking about or planning for 5-10 years down the road.
Yeah, it's basically like the opposite of all of those executive functioning skills, like prefrontal cortex. I love, I was just reflecting, all of that you said is just so good. And, I majored in psychology, and I remember I switched majors because I just loved my intro class. And then I have always liked psychology because to me, it just like makes sense. I just feel like everything people say, I'm like, yes, like, duh, like, of course that makes sense. But the way you just explained about at the beginning about the brain forming patterns and the stoplights, and I've heard this a million times presented a different way, but I just loved it, like really clicked for me. I love the way you explained that about how we look for patterns because there's way too many use of various stimuli, right? So we're looking for patterns, and then if that's what we know, then of course that's what we're going to expect because that's all we've ever known. So that was just kind of like light bulb for me, like, oh my gosh.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So hopefully for the listeners as well. Do you use any, like the ACEs indicator at your school or with your students?
That's a good question. So I have a couple thoughts on this. First of all, is that one year I did the ACEs survey to the entire school. To identify, we in Chicago Public Schools do a great small group that I highly recommend people look into if you're working with adolescents. It's called Structured Psychotherapy for Adolescents Responding to Chronic Stress. It's SPARCS for short. It's wonderful. And part of it is you screen kids at the beginning and the end to figure out what traumas they've experienced, but also like what there's a measure that you use to figure out what symptoms they've experienced in the past 2 weeks. And hopefully over the course of the program, you're helping them to decrease their symptoms. Anyways, so this is when I was an intern, actually, and I decided that I was going to survey the entire school to figure out who should be in this group. Well, almost the entire school qualified for the group. And so I was like, okay, that was maybe not what I wanted to do, because now I have uncovered a level of need that I am not prepared to meet. Like, I am one person. This group is capped at 8 people max, but really I don't even like to go that big. And we have like 500 kids in the school. This is not going to work. And I kind of wish I could take it back, because now I feel like I've committed myself to serving students, and that's not physically possible. So that was a little bit of a lesson learned. So now I do use the ACEs as sort of like a starting point for thinking about trauma. However, I think that while the ACEs was really revolutionary, we've also moved our thinking past just those indicators of trauma to thinking also about, like, we know that intergenerational trauma is a thing. So when parents, grandparents have experienced traumas, that trickles down epigenetically into the children. Racism, other forms of systemic oppression, and those microaggressions that students might experience on a daily basis, that can be traumatic. And then also just having the awareness that just because something is on a list of traumatic experiences, it's really more about how the kid responds to it. So for example, I grew up in a single parent household, which is definitely one of the trauma indicators. To me, it was not a traumatic experience. That was just my entire life. That's all I knew. And I had a positive home life. And so it didn't feel like a stressor, like it very well could be for another person. So we also want to be careful about remembering that it's both this experience as well as the child's response to that experience. And also vice versa. I've had students experience things like, for example, like students who just know people who've been murdered. For some kids, that's not traumatic. For some kids, that's actually hugely traumatic, even though it's like, sometimes, honestly, when I get overwhelmed at work and I have a million things to do and a kid comes to me crying because they know somebody who knows somebody who's been killed, sometimes my first response is like, in my head, of course, I don't say this out loud, but like, oh my God, like, get over it. It's not that big of a deal. You don't even know this person. No, like sometimes that can be earth shattering to know that somebody who lives like maybe 20 miles from you was killed in an unexpected way. And it's maybe a story you've heard before that happens sometimes. That can be traumatic. And so I've sort of learned to focus less on the events that are causing the trauma and more on like the symptoms that I'm seeing.
Okay. No, that's super helpful. Thank you. Because I think a lot of counselors are wondering if they should be doing these kind of screeners, if it's helpful or harmful or what. So thank you for that. Okay. Now, how can counselors be more trauma informed when we're working with our students?
Yeah. I think it really starts with the relationship. And honestly, 99% of what I am saying, you will probably already see yourself doing with students. So I say just give yourself a pat on the back, because it's really about building that strong relationship, co-regulating with students when they are escalated, being just sort of aware and noticing things about them, in terms of both noticing little positive things that you can share. Oh, I saw that you got right to work on that assignment the other day. Nice job. Or also like being aware, like, it seems to me that on Mondays, this kid is having a hard day. Like, I'm going to file that in my brain to just be aware of. Being flexible. So this is one that I have had to work on a lot in terms of, it's not your way or the highway as the adult. Yes, you are allowed to set firm expectations for students, but they might have other ways that they can meet those expectations that are different than you were thinking. So for example, like a common one is totally understand why teachers need kids to sit in their seat, because otherwise it's complete chaos, especially when you have overcrowded classrooms, things like that. But one thing I've learned is like, can we let go of I had a kid who wanted to sit under his desk. Like, is that okay? And there might be chance or circumstances where it's not okay, but if that doesn't disrupt learning, if the kid can still access the lesson from under his desk, well, who cares? Like, we're not going to fight that battle. Right. I can't have him running around the house or running around the classroom disturbing other kids or pushing or things like that. But if he's like in the general vicinity, or like my kids who need to move around a lot and like maybe they want to stand right behind their chair, so I've put like a tape square on the ground or something like that. It's like, yeah, as long as you're in this square, you're fine, but you can't leave this square. So just learning to be flexible in making sure that students are getting what they need, while you're also making sure that they're following the expectations. So I think just being like clear and predictable and reliable is super important. So making sure it's known what your expectations are, making sure that you are doing what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. I also give kids heads up. Like if I'm going to be absent, I will let them know if I can in advance. Because that can feel scary to have an adult just disappear, even if it's, sick days happen, things like that. But just having a way to communicate to a kid that I'm not going to be available on a particular day or something like that. Or even honestly, and I'm sure counselors feel the same way, I get pulled away for crises all the time. And so I have a conversation with students when I'm setting up their appointment time with me that's like, if I don't come and get you, it probably means that there's a kid who really, really needs help right now. And I had to go help them, but I will make it up to you. So I don't want you to feel scared if, 2:00 comes around and I don't come and get you. Know that I didn't forget about you. I still am excited to spend some time with you, but I had something that was really, really urgent and important that I had to take care of right now. And I promise you, I put you on a list to make it up to you later this week. Mm-hmm. So I set that expectation, right? Because it's hard to say be predictable when you're a school-based clinician. Like, does that really exist?
Yeah. I always talk to my listeners about like getting with your staff and developing like a crisis response team and everyone kind of being like on call or like tag teaming, because it's impossible to have consistently scheduled sessions otherwise. But I mean, in your case, it just sounds so challenging with the population at your school having so much trauma that it's like the student you're seeing, you have to prep them that you might not be there to see them, but because they've experienced something traumatic, you have to prep them a lot, but that's because you have to go respond to something else traumatic, oh gosh, that just sounds so challenging. But I'm so glad to pick your brain about it, because even with, you were saying you're like Southside Chicago and the community as a whole has experienced a lot of trauma, or continues to experience a lot of trauma. But I'm sure even counselors from all backgrounds, even if we're talking about like upper class private schools, I'm sure you have students who have experienced trauma. So this is helpful across the board for sure.
Yeah. And it's good not to make that assumption either, because it's like when I also have a private practice and I'm seeing people who have stable enough jobs that they have good insurance that they can, pay for my services. And so part of me was like, am I really doing real work in the same way that I'm doing? No, like, guess what? It turns out trauma affects everybody, not just certain communities, everybody. And so you can have the most privileged school community in the world, and I promise you still have kids who've experienced trauma.
Absolutely. So you were giving some strategies about, being consistent, reliable with the students, making those relationships. What about for the school community as a whole? How can counselors help encourage our teachers or admin to have a more trauma-informed care view?
Yeah, I think this is like the number one most impactful thing in terms of trauma-informed care that counselors or social workers can do. Because at the end of the day, no matter how trauma-informed you are as a practitioner, you're sending your kids back into a classroom that may or may not reflect that. And so, and then they get triggered and then they get sent back to you and it makes more work for you. So I think that like overall, that's like the best thing that you can do is really work with the staff. And I know that is way easier said than done, but like, it's about getting yourself on those professional development schedules and teaching teachers, first of all, what is trauma? How might it show up for students in their classrooms? What are things that they can do, such as like keeping the room relatively calm, making the schedule predictable, having a space in the classroom where kids can go to self-regulate, teaching teachers to self-regulate and making sure that they know how to handle behavioral situations in such a way that they are not responding from a place of extreme distress themselves. And then also you can, this is the part that you have a little more control over. You can build systems of support. I love check-in, check-out as a way to increase my capacity in the building and have other caring adults who can check in with kids twice a day and just, build that relationship, keep them on track towards their goals, things like that. Building restorative practices into the school community. I have not worked in a school with one, but some schools in Chicago public schools have a restorative practices coach in the building who is just there all day to referee, conflict that comes up. And so even if you can't have that, like what can you replicate of that model? And then whole school instruction, whatever that looks like in your building, I think making sure that we are teaching all students the skills that they need to be successful socially and emotionally.
Right, absolutely. And that's kind of like a two-part question I'm thinking of with our SEL lessons. So many of our counselors are going in once a month and doing these lessons. What are some topics that you think would be most helpful to prioritize for, as they're planning for next year? And then while teaching those lessons, what are some things we want to keep in mind in case students in the class have experienced trauma?
Yeah, I think like the two sort of main categories I think of as being important would be teaching kids how to build relationships. And so that's really important, helping them have that support system amongst peers. And then also teaching them self-awareness and then moving towards emotion regulation. So making sure that they can identify emotions within themselves and then they know how to handle those when they come up. I think that those are sort of the two most important areas, which like good news, you're probably already doing if you're a school counselor. And then I think you could add to that if you want to be more explicit about trauma, like add that psychoeducation piece, talk to them about the brain and how their brain works. And model while you're teaching that, that's a great opportunity to model how to handle behavioral challenges that come up in a trauma-informed way. And again, it's like some of it is about what you're doing and the explicit skills that you're teaching your students, but a lot of it is also about how you're doing it and how you're creating a safe classroom environment for all students.
Right. Oh, I love that. Those are great examples. And I was thinking, because I just was working on a group, that was emotional recognition, but it was for little kids. And I have, all the cutesy faces like angry, red cheeks, whatever. But then I'm thinking, you were saying some of these students who've experienced trauma, we're even looking at the neutral face and they're seeing negative. So even if your students are older, don't overlook those lessons that we might think are simple or common sense, or everyone already knows what happy, sad, mad looks like. I think it's really important to continue to teach that emotional awareness and the emotional regulation.
Yes. Yeah. And you can do it in fun ways for the big ones. Like I'm a big SpongeBob fan. And so I printed out a bunch of SpongeBob pictures of him like making different faces and made it into an emotion board in my room for students. And it's great because the little kids like it, but also high schoolers don't feel silly when they come in. I'm like, okay, which one resonates with you right now? They'll point to it and tell me why. Or like another good one is that I've used is celebrities, like have them find celebrities that they like making different faces. And absolutely, it's like, it doesn't mean that they have accomplished that goal of like truly understanding how to identify emotions just because they're not, in first grade anymore.
Right. Absolutely. Oh, this is so good. I have just loved this interview. Thank you so much.
Fun.
Can't wait for your session at Summer Summit. I'm sure, hopefully you saved some new stuff for us.
You did. Don't worry. Still all the videos.
Awesome. So I hope you guys, listeners, catch Joyce at Summer Summit. Where can we connect with you if the listeners have follow-up questions or want to learn more about the services you provide?
Yes. So I am launching my new website. So by the time this comes out, it should be launched. Nice. It's joyce-lcsw.com. And that is going to have a lot of things there. First of all, a bunch of resources, downloadable resources for interventions that you can do with kids, as well as full programs. Like I mentioned, check in, check out. I have a whole like beginning to end how to implement it, including PowerPoints for teachers, for implementers, all that kind of stuff. So I have those resources. I also have a membership that is starting. I'm offering clinical consultation at sort of the more intensive range, and then even just office hours, things like that you can have access to. And then starting to offer some courses too, to share, because I think, like we sort of said at the beginning, a lot of this stuff I just learned through experience and not necessarily from, my formal education. And so I'm going to be sharing more and more of that. But yeah, joyce-lcsw.com is where it's all going to be housed.
Awesome. That's great. Yes, we will link to that in the show notes so people can find you there. Thank you for your time. It was such a great episode, and we will see you at Summer Summit.
Awesome. I can't wait.
Thanks for listening to School Counseling Simplified. You can find the links from today's episode in the show notes. If you'd like to connect with Rachel, she's on Instagram and Teachers Pay Teachers at Bright Futures Counseling. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes of School Counseling Simplified. Talk to you next week.